Blackwave is on the air. Ready to hear a new scary story? Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment.
Seville breathed silence. The damp air absorbed every sound. The shuffling footsteps of a rare passerby, the soft voices of couples in the street cafes, the ringing of the bells of a distant chapel. Carla walked with a quick step, almost running, taking cover in the shadows of the facades of ancient houses. Her black cloak clung tightly around her figure, but the cold wind still penetrated under the fabric, chilling her to the bone. The last bus left at exactly midnight. Time pulled at her with threads of memories Carla tried to avoid. Today was 20 years since the last time Shed set foot in her family home. All those years, Shed remained silent, pretending that nothing from the past could get to her. But a series of coincidences had brought her to this city again. She turned down an alley where streetlights gave off a dead pale light. In the distance, at a bus stop, a timetable display burned dimly. Carla exhaled a sigh of relief. The bus was still there. Her steps slowed as she approached the stop. The bus looked unusual, old, shabby. It seemed alien against the backdrop of the city's modern infrastructure. The interior was illuminated by a yellow, rancid light that made it impossible to see the faces of the passengers. Carla felt a strange chill, but it was foolish to turn around now. She waved her hand, attracting the driver's attention. He didn't seem to pay any attention to her, but the doors opened with a slight hiss. She stepped inside. The bus was almost empty. Only a few people sat on the edges, slouched, avoiding looking at each other. Carla looked at the driver, a tall man in a cap, his face hidden by a shadow. He didn't turn to her, didn't ask her where she was going, just slammed the doors shut abruptly and drove off. Disculpe, ¿este autobús va hacia el centro? Carla asked, but there was no answer. She looked around the cabin. People seemed strangely frozen, as if their thoughts were somewhere far away in another world. No one even looked up as she passed by. Carla sat down in the window seat, trying not to look at the passengers. The night streets floated by outside the glass, but for a moment the familiar scenery changed to something darker. The narrow, intertwined streets now looked like a maze, the houses drowned in thick shadows, and the light of the street lamps became sullen, as if burned to the bottom. Carla turned to ask the driver again, but froze. The stop name board was blinking. Where the street name usually appeared, her name was now written Carla. "What the?" she whispered, feeling the cold sweat running down her back. She looked around at the passengers, hoping that at least one of them would notice the oddity. But they remained in the same poses, their faces shadowed. Only one of them, the man sitting closest, slowly turned his head toward her. His eyes glistened, and his lips trembled slightly, as if he were about to say something. But instead of words, a strange, squeaky sound came out of his mouth, like a scratch on glass. Carla looked away sharply and tried to open the window to get some fresh air, but it wouldn't budge. The bus slowed as if it were about to stop. A sign appeared behind the glass, but it was too blurry to read. Carla stood up and walked toward the driver. "Can you hear me?" she asked, trying to sound confident. "This is not my stop." But the driver didn't react. His figure remained as still as a statue. Carla slapped her palm against the glass partition separating him from the passengers, but the sound was drowned in a strange hum. She turned around and noticed that the scoreboard had changed again. It now read, Caninillo K. Occultus. Her breath caught. There was no way anyone could know. "You have no right," she shouted, even though she didn't know who she was talking to. At that moment, one of the passengers, a woman with a blank stare, whispered quietly, "You got on that bus for nothing." Carla felt the world around her begin to slowly disintegrate. Carla froze as she heard the woman's words. The whisper, as if it had come through a layer of water, filled her mind, crowding out all other sounds. She turned slowly to the passenger, but she was no longer looking at her. The woman sat turned away from the window, her expression impenetrable. Her pale fingers clutched the fabric of her skirt tightly, as if she were fighting her own fear. "What did you say?" Carla took a step toward her, but suddenly the bus shook violently, making her grab the handrail. Looking around, she realized she could no longer see the familiar buildings outside the windows. Instead of the streets of Seville, the landscape was strangely blurred, dark silhouettes of trees, sparse streetlights giving off a faint glow, and something like a thick fog that clung to the outside of the bus. "That's not my route," she muttered, and without waiting for the driver to answer, she turned to the passengers. "Excuse me, does anyone know where we're going?" There was silence again. No one reacted. Their motionless faces were like masks of either horror or indifference. Only one of the passengers, a middle-aged man with skin stretched over his cheekbones like a mummy's, looked up. His lips quivered, but no sound came out of his mouth. His eyes, reddish and glossy, seemed unnaturally large. Carla felt her breathing quicken. "What's the matter with you?" she asked, taking a step toward him. The man shrank back, as if her approach made him feel worse. His hands shook nervously, and his body instinctively turned away. Carla stepped back, feeling panic brewing inside. She tried to open the door. Her fingers trembled as she punched the emergency exit button, but nothing happened. The door didn't even move. "Stop the bus," she shouted to the driver. He was still sitting motionless. Carla ran up to him and knocked on the partition, but as if on purpose, her shout was drowned out by a muffled rustle. At that moment, the scoreboard flashed again. The sign changed. "No puedes escapar." Carla felt cold needles run up her spine. "What do you mean you can't escape?" she whispered, seemingly to herself. From behind her came a low, stifled laugh. She turned around sharply. This time the laughter came from the woman sitting at the window. Her body shook slightly, as if she couldn't contain her hysterical mirth, but her face remained dead calm. The sound was so unnatural that Carla recoiled, barely keeping her balance. "What are you laughing about?" Carla stepped closer, though her instinct screamed for her to back away. The woman didn't answer. Her laughter began to fade, and then she suddenly turned her head, staring directly at Carla. Her eyes were as white as a blind person's. "You've come for what you left behind," she whispered. "No one here can help you." Carla staggered back, nearly falling into the seat. "What are you talking about? What are you talking about?" But the woman stopped talking as suddenly as Shed started talking, turning back into a lifeless statue. Carla grabbed the handrail, trying to regain her breath. The bus continued to rush forward, passing increasingly bleak scenery. Her sense of reality was becoming shaky, as if she were in a dream. At that moment, Carla remembered the words she had heard earlier. "You got on that bus for nothing." Those words filled her mind as she replayed them over and over in her head. The lights in the cabin began to flicker. Carla noticed that the figures of the passengers began to change. Their outlines seemed less and less clear. Their faces seemed to melt into strange blurs. She felt panic overwhelm her. "I want out," she shouted, running to the door. The doors remained firmly shut. Carla turned to look at the driver again, but this time she couldn't see him. Where the man had sat before, there was now only a silhouette shrouded in darkness. She glanced at the scoreboard again. "Distimeitse, prepárate para lo que vendrá." Carla clutched at the handrail, feeling her heart pounding frantically. She realized that everything that was happening wasn't just a ridiculous accident. This bus was taking her somewhere where she would have to pay for what she was hiding. Her hands trembled as she turned around to look at the passengers. Every one of them now looked like a distorted memory. Faces stretched out, transformed into images of people she had once known or betrayed. "No," she whispered, stepping back. Suddenly, the bus jolted again. The lights went out completely, and Carla was left in total darkness. When the lights came back on, Carla felt something had changed. It was as if the interior of the bus had become narrower. The aisle between the seats was narrower. The walls seemed to come closer. The passengers sat still, but their faces were no longer hidden in the shadows. Carla could see them all too clearly now. The man with the gray eyes in the front seat she had noticed earlier was looking directly at her. His face, previously seemingly lifeless, now expressed something more. It wasn't angry, but it was judgmental. "You know why you're here," he said quietly, though his lips didn't move. Carla pulled back sharply, hitting the edge of the seat. Are you talking? Who are you?" But he had already turned away, his face frozen again in an indifferent mask. She tried to breathe more deeply, to calm herself, but the bus seemed to vibrate like a living thing. The floor beneath her feet either shook or pulsed like a heart. The scoreboard blinked again. This time it read the single word Carla. No, she whispered, trying to hold back the tears. Outside the window, a new nightmare unfolded. The landscape was a pile of ruins. Buildings like the ones Carla had seen in her childhood stood askew, with black holes in the windows. The bus seemed to be moving through time, taking her back to where she had fled. She knew these streets, recognized the collapsed wall of the old factory, the gravel sprinkled by the roadside. Every detail triggered a flash of memories she had buried for so long. "Stop!" she shouted to the driver, rushing toward him again. This time, as she peered behind the partition, the driver turned his head. His face was impossible to describe. It looked like a combination of several faces that changed every second. Her mother's eyes, her brother's lips, the nose of someone she had once loved. "You can't come out until you accept everything," came a voice. "Accept what?" Carla shouted, backing away. "You have me confused with someone else." But the voice didn't stop. Now it was coming from everywhere, overlaid with the noise of the bus. You know. The panic was growing. Carla grabbed the handrail to keep her balance as the bus slowed abruptly. It stopped at a place she recognized immediately. The scoreboard lit up, reminder. "No, not getting off," she shouted, huddling against the back door. But no one tried to make her. The bus was waiting. Carla glanced at the passengers. Their faces remained unchanged, but one person rose from her seat. It was the same woman who had laughed earlier. Her figure was unsteady, but she walked slowly toward the door, ignoring Carla. Carla watched the woman get off the bus and disappear into the darkness beyond the headlights. No one moved to retrieve her. "Where did you let her go?" Carla shouted, but there was no response. She knew it would be her turn. Her gaze fell back to the scoreboard, where a new text flashed. Time expired. Carla heard a strange noise. It was the sound of footsteps, but not inside the bus, but outside, as if someone was walking around looking for an entrance. She pressed herself against the window, but saw nothing but dense darkness. The sign had changed. It now said, "Tell the truth." The truth? About what? Carla whispered, feeling something sharp prick her chest. Her memories began to surface like scattered images. She saw herself as a young woman standing on the porch of an old house. There was something heavy in her hands, anger in her eyes, someone's voice screaming her name. "I didn't mean to," she screamed, clamping her ears shut. But the images kept coming back. The blood on her hands, the face of the man who had asked for forgiveness, her cold stare. Carla collapsed to the floor of the bus, huddled together. Please make it stop. The final message flashed on the scoreboard. Go, or stay forever. She knew she couldn't hide. The bus slowed again. Something familiar flashed outside the windows. It was the same house Shed left 20 years ago. The doors opened with a hiss, and Carla heard a voice from the past calling her. Carla. She took a step toward the exit. Carla stood on the threshold of the bus, feeling the night encompass her in its cold embrace. The air was thick with the smell of earth, decay, and something else, subtle but painfully familiar. The alleyway leading to the old house stretched out in front of her. It looked just as it had in her memories. Peeling paint on the walls, a drooping roof, and a porch overgrown with grass. She didn't want to go, but the bus pushed her forward as if it were alive. The doors hissed shut behind her, and the engine roared to life, leaving her alone in the night. Carla turned around, trying to shout something, but the headlights were gone. There was a ringing silence, only the wind whispering words she couldn't make out. The house pulled her like a magnet. Each step was difficult, as if invisible hands were holding her in place. I shouldn't have come back, she whispered, her heart racing. This place had once been her refuge, but now it frightened her. She remembered the summer 20 years ago, when everything had changed. That day, the hot air had smelled of blood, and the whispers of her family discussing her deed had turned into a never-ending sentence. You deserved it, she thought. A figure stood on the doorstep. At first, Carla thought it was a shadow play, but then she saw it. Someone was waiting for her. The man was short, wrapped in a long dark coat. She couldn't see his face, but the sensation of that gaze burning through her was almost unbearable. Who are you? Her voice trailed off, but the figure remained silent. She took a step forward, feeling her legs shake. Suddenly, the door of the house opened slowly. It smelled cold and musty inside, as if the house had been abandoned for hundreds of years. The figure disappeared, vanishing into the darkness of the doorway. Carla swallowed, feeling the air grow thick, almost viscous. I didn't mean to, she whispered, stepping up onto the porch. Inside, everything looked just as she remembered. The wooden floor that creaked under her feet, the old closet against the wall, the clock with the cracked glass that stood at 23:47. But something was wrong. The room seemed wider, the shadows longer, and the smell the same one that had haunted her all her life. She covered her mouth with her hand, trying to suppress a bout of nausea. A mirror hung on the wall. Carla froze when she saw her reflection in it. It was her, but not as she was now. She was a girl in her 20s, with disheveled hair and a face stained with blood. That's not me, she whispered, backing away. But it is you, said a familiar voice. Carla turned around. There was a boy sitting in the corner of the room. He looked to be about 10 years old. His face was pale, and his eyes were staring straight at her. You shouldn't be here, he said quietly. Who are you? Carla asked, feeling her legs shake. The boy stood up. His figure was as shaky as the shadows around him. You remember me, he answered, taking a step forward. I was here then. Carla grabbed the wall to keep from falling. You can't be. Her voice became hoarse. You're dead. The boy nodded. You did it, he said. The memories came like a wave. Carla saw that night again. The heated argument, her scream, her brother's face begging for mercy, her hands clutching the heavy candlestick and the crunching sound of its fall. She shuddered. It was an accident, she whispered. You lied to everyone, the boy said, coming closer. You lied to yourself. She closed her eyes, but the memories kept surfacing. How she had hidden the body. How she had made her parents believe had run away. How she had left on her own, never to return. I couldn't tell the truth, she whispered. You could have, but you chose to lie. The boy's voice grew louder and louder. The room around them began to change. The floor became sticky. The walls seemed to breathe. Shadows crawled out of the corners, condensing into shapes she recognized. It was her parents, sitting by an empty table. Their eyes were empty, their faces haggard. "You destroyed us," her father said, his voice echoing through the room. Carla backed away, but there was a new figure behind her. It was a woman, her mother, but the woman's face was contorted with grief and hatred. "You left us," her mother whispered. Carla fell to her knees, covering her face with her hands. "Forgive me," she screamed. "I didn't know any other way." Around her, the voices grew louder and louder, turning into an endless chorus of accusations. She felt something cold touch her shoulder. Looking up, Carla saw the boy. "It's not too late," he said. "You can redeem yourself." "How?" she asked, barely holding back her tears. You know, Carla realized what he meant, but what he was asking meant giving up everything she had. "You have to choose," the boy said. "Either you stay here with us, or you accept your guilt." In the boy's hands appeared an object she recognized immediately, an old candlestick. Carla closed her eyes, realizing there was no way out. The candlestick in the boy's hands glistened as if the metal had been restored to its original luster. Carla couldn't look away. A heavy, massive object, so familiar, but now seemingly alien. In its glow, she saw not her own face, but her brother's, frightened, bloody, pleading. "You have to take it." The boy's voice was louder now, breaking the silence. "Why?" Carla exhaled, unable to reach out her hand. The boy tilted his head, his eyes shining like two glass beads. "It's a part of you, like me, like everything you've done." Carla gritted her teeth, feeling her throat constrict. The room around her began to change again. Her parents' shadows were gone, but their voices echoed through the house. Her father was accusing, her mother was sobbing, and in every sound Carla heard broken lives. "It was a mistake," she whispered, feeling weakness seize her body. "Mistakes don't matter," the boy replied. "What matters is what you did afterward." He stepped closer, holding out the candlestick to her. Carla instinctively backed away, but a chair was behind her. She sat down as if her body refused to obey. "You can't escape," the boy continued. "You've already tried." Carla closed her eyes. The memories came back to her like a heavy weight. That night, the blood on her hands, the horror that came over her when she realized what she had done. Her brother was lying on the floor, and she was standing over him, clutching that very candlestick. She tried to justify herself to herself. Head threatened her, yelled at her, but deep down she knew she hadn't hit him by accident. She had done it because she had been seized by a hatred she had nurtured for years. "You knew what you were doing," the boy interrupted her thoughts again. The walls of the room began to narrow, the air growing heavier, as if the house was trying to swallow her up. Carla clutched her temples with her hands, trying to drown out the voices, but they only grew louder. "Why are you doing this?" She screamed. "What do you want?" "The truth," the boy replied. "You must recognize the truth." He held out the candlestick again, and Carla realized she had no other choice. She took it carefully. The metal was as cold as ice, and for a moment she thought her fingers were stuck to the surface. When she looked at the boy, his face had changed. It was no longer a child, but her brother as he had been that night. His eyes were filled with pain and disappointment. "Why?" he asked, and his voice echoed in her head. Carla squeezed her eyes shut. "Because I hated you," she shouted, feeling the words tearing out of her like a knife ripping through flesh. The voices fell silent. There was dead silence in the room. When she opened her eyes, her brother was gone. Instead, the candlestick was on the floor, but now it was broken like her. Carla fell to her knees, trembling. What now? She asked, staring into the void. The house was no longer her home. The room seemed alien, the walls moving as if they were alive, reaching for her like dead men's hands. You must choose, the voice said again, but now it came from everywhere. A bus appeared in front of Carla. Its doors opened with a hiss, and inside were the shadows of passengers. They were looking at her, but this time their faces were expectant. If you get on, you'll pay, said a voice. If you stay, you disappear. Carla knew what that payment was. Inside the bus was her path to redemption, but it would require her to make sacrifices. Everything she wanted to keep, everything she had built over the years, would disappear. She would become nothing, but staying here meant worse. She would become part of the house, trapped in her memories, stuck on the very day she had ruined her life. She took a step forward. I agree, she whispered, stepping onto the bus. The doors closed behind her, and in a second the house was gone, leaving only dark nothingness outside the window. The lights in the interior of the bus began to flicker again. The sign lit up with new words, before ITS late. Carla sat back in her seat, clutching the candlestick in her hands. She knew the journey wasn't over yet. The bus moved endlessly. Its rhythmic pounding was like the beating of a heart not hers, but someone else's, huge and alien. Outside the windows, there was nothing but darkness. Even time seemed to have stopped. Carla sat in her seat, clutching the candlestick tightly. It was warmer, as if it had a life of its own, and her palms were sweating with tension. The passengers, previously motionless, began to move. Their movements were strange, jagged, as if they were being controlled by puppeteers. Carla's head was filled with whispers, incomprehensible but demanding. She closed her eyes, trying to drown them out, but the voices only grew louder. Get up, Carla, came a commanding voice from somewhere. She opened her eyes and saw the driver standing in front of her. He was standing beside her, towering over her, his face hidden by shadows. We're here, he said, pointing to the door. Carla looked that way. The doors opened, and cold air rushed into the cabin, smelling rotten and damp. In the darkness outside the door, lights that looked like burning candles could be seen. Where am I supposed to go? She whispered. Where it all begins, the driver answered. He made no move to push her out, but she realized she could not refuse to leave. With trembling hands, she rose and stepped toward the doors. Outside, she found herself on a narrow, stony path. Strange figures lined either side of her. Their bodies seemed curved like charred trees, and their faces were empty hollows, candles burned in their hands, casting long, distorted shadows. Carla walked slowly forward, feeling the silence weighing down on her. Each step echoed in her ears like a loud thump. The path led her to a huge mirror, standing upright on the ground. It looked as if it had grown out of stone, its frame covered with strange symbols that looked like scars. Carla stepped closer and peered inside. In the reflection, she saw herself, but it wasn't her present self. It was a girl from the past, covered in blood, with a blank stare and a heavy candlestick in her hands. You can't run away, her reflected copy said. You can only accept. I've already admitted my guilt, Carla replied, tears running down her cheeks. It's not enough. You have to go all the way, the copy said. The mirror shook and then it shattered. Carla squeezed her eyes shut to protect herself from the shards, but she felt nothing. When she opened her eyes, there was a different scene around her. She was back in the old house, but it looked different now. The floor was soaked with blood. The walls pulsed like living things, hands reaching out from the corners trying to grab her. In the center of the room lay her brother. His eyes were staring straight at her, and his mouth was moving, mouthing words she couldn't make out. The candlestick was back in her hands. "You have to finish this," came the driver's voice. Carla didn't know where it came from, but she felt it was her last choice. She lowered her gaze to her brother. He looked at her with longing and disappointment. "I can't," she whispered. "Yes, you can," the voice answered. Carla raised the candlestick above her head, feeling all her guilt, fear, and hatred flow into the gesture. She lowered it. At that moment, the house disappeared. Carla found herself back on the bus. But now it was empty. There was no driver, no passengers. She was the only one sitting in the endless, strangely lit interior. On the scoreboard it read, "Forgiveness." Carla felt something inside her finally let go. She was no longer holding the candlestick. Her hands were clean. The bus slowed down. Dawn appeared outside the window. It stopped. The doors opened, and Carla hesitated and stepped out. She found herself in Seville, the same place where it had all started. But the city was different now. People were walking through the streets, laughing. Life went on as if nothing had happened. Carla breathed in the fresh air. She realized that her duty was complete. But with it came the realization that she was no longer a part of this world. A horn sounded behind her. She turned around, but the bus was gone.